Hello, Rob. Very nice to see you. How are you doing?
Very well, thanks, Steve. Very well. Hunkered down like the rest of New Zealand, working from home, but otherwise I'm fine. How are you?
Yeah, good to hear. Just been beavering away. I'm saying to people that it's business as usual. It's probably not quite that, but at least I have the lawnmower very nearby for a bit of a pastime, and I have the skill saw just to my right. So depending on how things develop, I can fit in a little bit of home handyman stuff. But anyway, Rob, something that you and
Excellent.
it is good, thank you. And something that you and I have been chatting about recently, Rob, is in light of the present circumstances, business interruption. Rob, just for my benefit, and I should probably know this, but what is business interruption insurance?
Typically, business interruption insurance is insurance that will pay out to a business in the event that that business's normal commercial activity is interrupted.
Okay, and
Most business interruption policies are, uh, well, arise or come into effect when some sort of damage is suffered, usually to the property owned by the person who's insured, that prevents that insured business typically from undertaking its normal commercial activities.
okay, and what is the usual? Because I'm familiar with most forms of insurance, although I've kind of temporarily repressed my memories about business interruption. What's the usual trigger, if I can use that word? What's the usual trigger for a business interruption policy?
Most policies will be triggered or would normally contemplate being triggered when there is damage to property that's owned or used by the insured. So if you think of a circumstance that we're all familiar with, something like the Christchurch earthquake triggered a great number of business interruption claims. And typically those claims were triggered because, for example, the shop that the business was operating from was completely destroyed. There was some sort of physical damage to property prevented a business from operating. And that's in very basic terms what it's designed, or what business interruption insurance is written in contemplation of. Now it gets more complicated the further you move away from physical damage. And I should emphasize this all depends on the wording of an individual policy.
Naturally.
So I'm speaking in very broad terms here. But there are there are nuances to it. So for example, you might be in a situation, and this happened quite a bit in Christchurch, where a property is damaged such that you're unable to enter the property, but otherwise the property is fine. Now, a person might say, well, I can't enter this property, I therefore can't conduct my normal business, therefore my business has been interrupted and I should be able to claim. Whether you are able to claim or not depends on the wording of the policy. And that's a really important consideration in the present situation.
So, Rob, how does that, coming on to the present situation, as we put it, the existence on the one hand, empirically, of a global pandemic, which is recognized to have occurred in New Zealand also, on the one hand, and on the other hand, perhaps as a discrete element, a government decree, I guess, I think that probably is the right word, or certainly a fiat, that there has been a pandemic, and perhaps thirdly, an edict or a fiat, a declaration that businesses shall not be open, such that if they do, they'll be doing something illegal. Could you perhaps break down those three elements a little bit in the context of business interruption?
So the first thing we've got is the pandemic, the infectious disease. Now, and again, we're talking in very general terms because it depends on the wording of each policy. But in general, business interruption policies will exclude liability for losses arising from infectious disease.
Right.
And I'm looking at a business interruption policy now, and it's got a standard exclusion in it that states that it does not ensure loss, damage, or interruption in connection with any infectious animal or human disease.
Okay.
So that, and that's not an unusual exclusion in business interruption insurance policies. And that would often serve to make sure that there is no cover for business interruption arising from infectious disease.
Okay.
And so that would mean, for example, that if you were running a factory and all your staff came down with the flu and were off work for 2 or 3 weeks, that you couldn't make a claim under this policy.
Okay.
Now, where the situation we are in at the moment differs somewhat from what might be contemplated in the normal infectious disease exclusion is that, in fact, the business interruption that most people are suffering now is a result of the government, as you say, by fiat or by lawful order, exercising its legal rights and obligations pursuant to certain legislation. The government has mandated that businesses shall shut down, and it's actually said that it should be unlawful for them. Now, that's different from a loss that arises directly from an infectious disease. And the policy I'm looking at now, in fact, would cover business interruption that happens as a result of that sort of action. And that's because it has a specific provision that covers loss that arises from interference with the business in consequence of action taken by a civil authority following the outbreak of any infectious disease.
Right. Right. That's very specific.
And it is very specific. But for people who have business interruption insurance, the government, it's probably helpful to them that this has been a shutdown mandated by the government or enforced by the government. So it's not, it's not a case of somebody in a business trying to make a claim because they say, well, look, we had to do the sensible thing when we heard about this disease. We had to shut our premises so our staff didn't get sick. Most insurers would say, well, yes, that's very responsible, but it doesn't trigger a loss. But because the shutdown has been mandated by government, again, depending on the policy, there is a much better chance that there will be coverage under a business interruption policy. And if I'm looking at this particular policy I'm looking at, and it's a very industry specific one, but it,
okay.
And that's the other thing about business interruption policies. There's no one size fits all. There are different business interruption policies for different industries. So you might have education, and the education industry might have one sort of policy from one insurer. Retail industry might have a different sort of policy from the same insurer. So the wording of individual policy documents is very important, and there are a lot of different individual policy documents for business interruption. But this particular one, for example, specifically covers loss that arises from things like this government-mandated shutdown. There's usually a pretty specific cap on the amount of cover that will be provided. It'll be something like 25% of annual turnover or something like that.
Okay.
And in some cases, you may also find that the policy is underwritten by someone different from your normal insurer as well. So you might get a policy from, let's say, AMI or something like that. And I'm not saying that this is what's in an AMI policy, but I'm just using that name as an example.
Sure.
You might have a policy from them that covers this sort of government-mandated shutdown. But if you look in the fine print, you might find that, in fact, the people who are responsible for payout in that case are underwriters at Lloyd's, for example, or something like that. So
very interesting.
Various things to be aware of in it.
Okay, well that's
typically.
Go ahead.
Sorry,
please.
you go.
No, go ahead. No, I'm listening. Please proceed.
I want to say, typically the way these policies will pay out is they'll have some sort of formula in there for working out what you're entitled to. You'll get some sort of ratio of your gross profit or something like that. Will be the sum paid out. So they'll have a definition in there of gross profit, and it'll be something like, income received less direct expenses, less value of stock on hand. And then that'll be prorated over a weekly basis for the year, or something like that.
Yes, that's where I was going to chip in, that even in the ordinary course of things, in my experience, business interruption claims are often tricky, not so much from a general coverage point of view, but actually that accounting / calculation side. And certainly there are businesses out there who are in the business of helping insureds and customers with that side. And typically a BI claim is resolved in the end by the accounting representatives appointed by each, coming to some common understanding of the underlying data and calculations. So is that your experience as well, Rob?
Yes, that's right. There will usually be a relatively difficult calculation to be done to establish the amount that's to be paid out. Now, there's, and again, the nature of that calculation will vary from policy to policy, but for example, some policies may cover you for staff wages, for example, when the business is interrupted.
Right.
Others may require you to take steps to mitigate your loss that could include laying off staff.
Interesting.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's some pretty horrible sort of considerations to be made in respect of what your business cover is, business interruption cover is. But generally speaking, it's to replace lost profit. So, so you need to be very careful when you look at your policy to ascertain exactly what cover you're entitled to and what that might look like and what sort of amounts that may cover. Because if you're a business that makes a gross profit of $200,000 a year, say, that $200,000 gross profit may be covered, but that same business may have a wages bill of $500,000, and it's not automatic that wages bill will be covered.
Yes, got it. Yeah, there's certainly some there's potential complexity, and there isn't there. No, just from my own experience, a separate head of cover, sometimes increased cost of working, sometimes is separate to or sits alongside the gross profit calculation, and that itself sometimes introduces a set of its own considerations and things. So I guess that just to summarize and to kind of start wrapping up in terms of the time we have, people will be considering whether they have a business interruption policy at all. Often it will be kind of incidental to what is called in the market a material damage policy. In the ordinary course of things, they're kind of linked to accidental loss or damage, but as is the case with the particular policy that you have in front of you, there's one exclusion for that would apply to pandemics, but in fact there is, I'm not quite sure what the correct characterization of it would be, but
there's specific coverage for government mandated shutdowns due to infectious disease in this. And there's a number of, it's very specific in this policy, but I've seen a number of policies where the fact your business, the government has ordered you to shut down your business, that's an event that triggers cover.
Right.
Business interruption. As I say, it's not an invariable part of every business interruption policy, but it is in there in some of them. And it's worth taking the time to look at your policy document to find out if that cover exists for you.
Right. And in a situation where there was an exclusion for infectious disease, etc., as you outlined, on the one hand, and on the other hand, either an extension or a separate head of cover in relation to government mandated shutdown, but where that's not linked to disease, I suppose there's a discussion to be had about whether there's cover at all or the extent of that cover. Is there not?
There is and it will depend very much on the wording of the individual policy. But certainly I've seen a number of business interruption policies where there seems to be a disconnect between the cover that's provided with them on the one hand, which extends to things like government mandated shutdowns, and then an exclusion on the other hand for something like infectious diseases. Generally speaking, if there's an ambiguity, a genuine ambiguity between cover and exclusion, such that the policy just doesn't make sense, then that ambiguity is going to be resolved in favour of the insured person rather than the insurer. But sometimes it's quite clear from the policy that the exclusion's meant to rule as well. So, yeah.
So it's going to be a question of looking at each individual policy and if there's any doubt, kind of seeking appropriate advice if required.
That's correct. Yes, look, and at first instance, most people should be able to just talk to their insurance brokers who will have a pretty good idea of what is and is not covered. And then if necessary, it can be escalated to a lawyer.
Yes, right. No, I suppose that's a situation where the broker feels that there is cover, has had a discussion with an insurer representative who has come to a contrary view, and in the discussions between the broker and the insurer representative, they reach a bit of an impasse. Rob, if people want to get hold of you, what should they do?
Just look at my website, I guess. That's got all my contact details, Rob at roblattonbarrister.co.nz, or at my email address, rob@roblatton, LATTON.co.nz. And I'm also mindful of the fact, Steve, that they could probably get quite useful advice from you.
Sure thing, yes. And anyone watching this will be able to find my contact details just below this video. But in case that's not coming up, I'm available at stevekeall.com. just to reiterate, for most people, they will be having, the situation might be self-evident, particularly if there's an exclusion for infectious disease and kind of no other obvious kind of source of cover. Then be having a discussion with the broker. The brokers, of course, all understand their own products very, very well,
Yes.
particularly where it's a broker written wording, and they will know precisely what their underwriting intention was. But in situations where there's some unresolvable conflict, it might pay for people to take advice. Well, I'm going to wrap up there, Rob, because my daughter is about to have the end of her allotted 30 minutes of TV, which finishes at precisely at 2:40 p.m. And God knows
Excellent.
that can't go over
I have
time.
to go and iron the shirts that are hanging up behind me.
I can see that.
It's a good time.
And Rob, I just want to assure you, I'm not going to ask you to stand up, but like me, you're perfectly well attired from the chest up, and really in these difficult times, that's what counts.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Okay, Rob.
Glad I met you.
Over and out. See you soon.
Thanks, Steve.